global gardeners. Happy Monday. It's the start of another great gardening week. Great to have you here. Today, let's talk about harvest time. Some of you have already started harvesting. Some are directly in the middle of harvesting, and some of us are yet to get to the harvest point. So I'll be throwing out lots of different ideas, lots of suggestions, some tips. I'm interested in hearing about your tips as well. So as we talk about different food crops that we're growing in our vegetable garden, let me know what you think and what you use to determine the best time to pick. And of course, along the way, whatever questions you have in your garden, let's see how many we can answer over the course of the next 90 minutes. Let's go ahead and start with an important point when we're talking about our garden. Eva Nichols Art says, good morning from sunny Truckee, California. Hello to you. It's 49 degrees Fahrenheit right now, about 9.5 Celsius. We'll be in the upper 70s as the sun gets higher. That's about 26 Celsius. Here's the most important part about this, though, is we rarely have night temperatures above 50 Fahrenheit. That's 10 Celsius. So getting tomatoes and peppers to ripen is hard. Yes, during the summer growing season, ripening of plants can be completely mixed. Some really like the heat, some don't like any heat, and some need some very specific temperatures. So when we talk about plants like tomatoes, when they start dropping below that 50 degree Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius point, it essentially shuts down the ripening process. So when it warms up during the day, it kicks back in. At night, it slows down. And so that can actually lengthen the amount of time it takes for the fruit, the tomato, to ripen. So the first thing that I recommend when it comes to determining when you're going to harvest your plants is to check the seed packet, to go online and look up that plant and find out how long it's going to take to reach maturity or days to harvest. And so a lot of the tomatoes I grow are in the 60 to 80 day range. So they're set to be harvested 60 to 80 days after that plant is actively growing. Well, that is based on everything being right. Nice sunny days, nice warm nights, not too much wind, adequate soil moisture. It's good conditions. So when you have a situation where your nights are still cold or are starting to get cold again, that can delay that time. So you may be growing a tomato that is an 80-day variety, but if you were late to get it in the ground or you have those cold nights, it might take 90 days. It might take 100 days for those tomatoes to fully ripen. So as we talk about this subject today, feel free to definitely take notes, but most importantly, take notes within your own garden. What is happening with your crops? And how does that compare with what you expected? It happens to me every season. I put something in the ground, I look at the seed packet, it tells me that I can expect that lettuce to be ready in 45 days. And at 45 days, it's a plant, it's growing, but I need another week before that lettuce is adequate for harvesting. All of our gardens are different. Yours may actually be faster because the conditions are ideal for the plants that you're growing. So the general guidelines, the tips of when we harvest our various food crops can vary from garden to garden, and it can also vary by gardener as to what you're looking for. Now let's stay on the topic of tomatoes, since that's a very popular fruit that we grow in our garden. Raise your hand. How many think that the tomato is ready to harvest when it turns fully red? Raise your hand. Tomato is ready when it turns red. Well, remember what I just said. It depends on the gardener, depends on the garden. Last year, I grew white Tomasol tomatoes. They were white when they were fully ripe. I I grew some black tomatoes. I grew some purple tomatoes. I grew some green tomatoes. When they were fully ripe, that was the color of the tomato. In fact, of the, what did I do? I think I did 12 or 14 varieties of tomatoes last year. I think only 4 or 5 of them were red tomatoes, because I also grew orange and yellow tomatoes. So be careful about some of this broad advice that you might see, and the broad assumptions about what you're looking for on your particular plants, and get to know your specific plants. I was growing a tomato last year that was a red tomato, but it was purple all season long. And I thought, well, this is odd. I've never had a tomato plant, where it started off as being a really dark purple. And I waited and I waited and I waited and I waited, and it got to that days of maturity, ready to harvest point, and they were still purple. And I thought, well, maybe there's something wrong with these tomatoes. So I plucked off one of those purple tomatoes and ate it. It was sour. It was completely unripe. I waited another week, and those purple tomatoes started turning red. When I looked into it at that point, which I should have done at the beginning of the season, I realized, yes, it is a red tomato, but I didn't really see much in the description that said it starts off as being purple. Blew my mind. So now, as I look at new tomato varieties I'm growing and all kinds of other plants, those are the kind of things I look for. What does it look like when it's young? What does it look like during the transition period to when it becomes ripe? And then what should it look like when it becomes ripe? And that can take away a lot of the stress. A lot of the concern you might have in your garden is just knowing what to look for. So when we talk about harvesting our different crops, we can break it down into a few different categories. The first being the fruit like a tomato, the fruit like a pepper. These are the kind of harvests that we can expect will change color in time. So all of my peppers, for the most part, I let fully ripen. And what that means for most of the peppers that I'm growing, and most of the peppers that you're probably growing, is that there will be a color change. You go to the store and you buy bell peppers, green bell peppers. Well, a green bell pepper, for the most part, is an unripe pepper. If you allow a green pepper to stay on your plant and continue maturing, it might turn into a yellow pepper or an orange pepper or a red pepper. And so when you buy a red bell pepper at the grocery store, it was green most of its life. And it wasn't until it started reaching maturity that it changed color. So for fruits, the visual aspect is a very important part of determining when to harvest it. When we talk about root crops, the visual is still there, but it's not quite as apparent, because how can you tell when a carrot is ready? Or how can you tell when a beet is ready, or a turnip? Because that's a root in the ground. Well, believe it or not, there is a visual. Carrots, turnips, beets, most of the root crops that we're growing, when they reach that maturity point, they actually start growing out of the ground. The top of those roots begin to break the surface. And so for carrots in particular, I'll often dig up a carrot just to see what the size is and how they're maturing periodically. So every couple of weeks, I might dig up a carrot just to see how they're doing. But I'm waiting until I see the top of the carrot start to break the surface. And that's a good visual indication that the carrot is telling me it's time to harvest. And I'll go ahead and pull one out, see the size, see its health, and I may end up harvesting the entire crop of carrots on the same day, even harvesting the ones whose tops have not broken the surface. Beets, most of the time they're going to be underground, but early they begin to break the surface. The longer you allow a beet to stay in the ground, the more of the top of the beet will grow above the ground. Now, the issue when we talk about some of these root crops, visually, you can look at it and say, okay, yeah, I think it's about time to harvest. The longer you wait, that top area that's being exposed to the sun, that's being exposed to the air, it can toughen a little bit. It can get a little bit fibrous. So finding that point that you like, where the root crop is ready to harvest, often becomes a personal choice. You can harvest the root crops early. You've probably had baby beets. You go to a nice restaurant and you have a baby beet salad. A baby beet is just a beet that was harvested immature. It wasn't allowed to fully ripen. The same with carrots, baby carrots. You can eat root crops like that at any stage of their development. They're just not mature. They're just a young carrot. If you like those kind of crops, then harvest them early. You don't need to wait all the way to what the seed packet tells you or to that full maturity date. For the leafy plants, the spinach, the lettuce, the chard, there's a lot of those kind of plants that we have the same type of option. We can harvest early or we can wait until they're fully mature. You can expect that the flavor will change over time based on when you harvest. The lettuces that I often like to grow are the kind that you can pull off some of the outer leaves. You don't pull up the whole plant. You just harvest some of the leaves so you can make a salad. And the plant will continue to grow and it'll continue to put out new leaves. And so that's the opportunity if you have a good crop of lettuce and you've got enough plants, is you don't have to harvest the whole plant. You can just keep coming back for more on a regular basis. Other plants like cabbage, for instance, when a cabbage is nice and firm and it's telling you it's ready to harvest, you're going to pull the whole plant. You're going to pull the whole cabbage and then take it into your kitchen to use. So understanding how you can harvest different types of plants, including, the pick and come again kind of lettuce. I've got so much of that in some of my beds from year to year that I use my method of seeding. They start pretty close together, maybe a little bit closer than what the seed packet recommends. And when it comes time to thin out my lettuce, I just pull out some of those full plants, and they're basically young lettuce. So early in the season, I'm eating the whole lettuce plant, cutting off the root, and its young, tender leaves. Later in the season, once the other lettuces begin to spread out, begin to reach maturity, then I just pull off the outer leaves as I need them. I tried to balance the timing because lettuces early in the season, when it starts getting hot, run the risk of bolting. And once they bolt, they start sending up the flower stalk, the flavor is going to change. So when I see that maybe some of the plants have started to bolt, that's an indication to just go ahead and pull all of the other plants that haven't bolted yet and start using that in salads, giving it away, whatever the solution happens to be if you suddenly have a whole bunch of lettuce that comes your way. So those are a few general guidelines as to the general categories that I tend to look at when I'm deciding what it is that I'm going to do. Rick is saying, does that mean a purple tomato turns red? Does it lose the benefits? So what you may be thinking, Rick, and it's the color purple offers different vitamins than the color red for the most part in the fruits and the roots and of the other plants that we're growing. So there's the first GMO tomato that was developed in New Jersey, I believe, is a purple tomato. And it was developed specifically to be purple to give those specific nutrients. And yes, as I understand it, if a purple tomato turns red, then some of that is lost. Gets to why you're growing your crops in the first place. Are you growing them for the specific nutrients? Are you growing them for the taste? Are you growing them just to be able to say you grew them? that plays a factor in deciding when you're going to harvest them as well. A good example of this, my buddy Tony O'Neill has experimented and worked very hard for years to grow supersize crops, to actually compete, to try to set world records on the size of some of the fruits in particular that he's growing. Zucchini is a perfect example. Zucchini should be harvested when it's about 6 to 8 inches long. If you like a nice, tender, sweet, delicious zucchini, about 6 to 8 inches is really the ideal point. But raise your hand again. How many of us never are able to harvest the zucchini at that size because they just get so big so fast? And instead, we're ending up harvesting the zucchini that's 12 inches or 14 inches long. And if you're someone like Tony, who's specifically growing varieties and tending to the plants to get them to grow even bigger, then the days to maturity, the taste, how you're going to use that doesn't matter. You want to keep the fruit on the vine as long as possible to get the bigger size. So how are you using your plants? And when we get to the question of when to harvest those plants, now you start understanding we might have differing times depending on how we're going to use it. I like making zucchini bread. I love grilled zucchini. I love sauteed zucchini. There's a lot of different ways I like zucchini, but I love zucchini bread. The zucchinis that make the best zucchini bread are those big zucchinis. So I will let mine go past that 8-inch point if I am specifically planning to make zucchini bread. If I'm going to grill my zucchini, I want them to be in about the 8 to 10-inch range because that's what fits on the grill best. If I'm going to be sauteing my zucchini, then that's when the 6 to 8-inch range tends to be best. The flavor is just so wonderful, and the size fits when I cut them into little slices and saute them with some garlic and onion and olive oil. It's fantastic. So there isn't always a single answer to when you should harvest because it's going to vary based on how you're going to use the crop. Tomatoes, if you're growing a red tomato, sure, wait until it turns red to harvest it when it's fully ripe. But at the end of the season, and especially if you like a green tomato salsa or fried green tomatoes or a green tomato chutney, then you're not going to wait until it changes color to full maturity. You're going to harvest it while it's still unripe, while it's still green. So it's perfectly fine for you to have your own specific timing based on what it is that you're going to grow. When we talk about tomatoes, tomatoes are one of those fun crops that will continue to ripen off the plant. Most of the plants that we're harvesting, most of the fruits that we're harvesting, most of the roots that we're harvesting, they're not going to continue to ripen. You pull a carrot from the ground, it's never getting any bigger. It's not going to ripen anymore. But a tomato, after a certain point, will. That's called the breaker point. You might have heard of it as the blush point. It's the point where the tomato has started changing color. And so it's easy to see with a red tomato. So the red tomato, when it's fully ripe, starts off green, and it's a green that actually changes shades from dark green to light green, depending on how young that tomato is. And then suddenly, one day, that green in a few spaces on that tomato will start to blush. It'll start to change color. That's more of a pink than a green. And then as it continues to ripen, that pink turns to red and the green begins to fade. Well, you can harvest tomatoes once they start that color change. Bring them inside, put them on a counter, put them in your pantry, and give them some time, and they will continue to ripen. That's a great option at the end of the season. If you've got some of those tomatoes, they're not fully ripe yet, they've started to blush and change color, you can bring them in and let them ripen. They ripen. I think, and I'd like to see what your opinions are on this, I think that a vine ripened tomato tastes better. So, yes, the tomato off the vine will ripen, but the texture just never quite reaches the point, and the taste never quite reaches the point that it would if it stayed on the vine until it reaches that full maturity and that full vine ripened point. So let me know what your thoughts are on that, because I've noticed a difference. Yeah, every year I bring tomatoes in that have started to blush, and I let them ripen, and I use them in my salads or however else I'm using the tomatoes. But there's just something about the one that's pulled right from the plant, and it really makes a difference. Big Wheel Dog says, I've had late season green tomatoes turn red when in a box with ripened ones. Yeah, and so even if they look like they're fully green, if they're right at that breaker point, they will continue. And it's the ethylene gas. So when we are looking at the big agriculture, the big farms, they're harvesting everything in a day and they're bringing them into the warehouse. Ethylene gas is what they use to control the ripening of those young tomatoes. And so you're exactly right. The point being is that the ripe tomatoes are putting off that gas, and that helps the young green tomatoes ripen faster. You can do the same thing with a banana. Bananas are a great way to ripen your tomatoes. So take those young blushing tomatoes, put them next to a ripe tomato, put them next to a banana, and you can expect that you'll see an increase in the time it takes for a lessening of the time to reach that ripe stage once it's off the plant. And yeah, it is definitely something that that you can do, is use other fruits to actually help you ripen the fruits that you have. Gina says, I agree with Scott. Vine ripened is best. But if I let my tomatoes go beyond the breaker point, the critters tend to chew on them. And that's really the point I wanted to start talking about. So let's go ahead and talk about it now. I was going to talk about it a little bit later. But deciding when to harvest is often influenced by other factors in the garden that we might not have any control over. And the critters play a big role in that. It's the birds, it's the squirrels, it's the raccoons, it's whatever pest you might have in the garden that's going to eat your crop. Then you probably want to harvest before those animals get to it. And you're exactly right. It's one of those things that if you let your fruit go too long, you may lose it completely. And so all of us are different. All of us have different pests with different considerations. I've said before that, particularly with my fruit trees, I have to be very careful about that. I've lost so many crops over the years. I usually tell a story about my apricots, where I went out, had just a handful of apricots. They were so beautiful. They looked perfect. And I said, tomorrow I'm going to come and harvest all of these apricots. And I came back the next morning and they'd all been eaten by the birds, because the birds know exactly the right time to get the flock together and to eat everything on your tree. So when you get to that point, if you are looking at your tomatoes, your apricots, whatever it happens to be, and you're thinking, tomorrow I'm going to harvest, my recommendation is do it today, because tomorrow might be too late. And if you've learned that the critters get to your tomatoes as soon as they start changing color, then as soon as you start seeing your tomatoes change color, it's time to harvest them, bring them inside, and get the ripening indoors in a protected environment away from those pests. The lettuces in particular, the plants I grow in the spring, it's the same kind of thing. I'll pull off a little lettuce leaf or a little bit of spinach, and it's got, oh, this is so good. And I'll keep harvesting this for the next 2 weeks. And of course, 3 days later, they start bolting and the flavor is lost, because I didn't pay enough attention to the forecast and how hot it was going to be and how windy it was going to be. those play a role too. This time of year, as summer begins to wane and we start getting into the fall, you can actually get a whole nother harvest with a whole nother crop by putting in some of those cool season plants. So if you start your lettuce and your spinach in August, well, by the time September and October comes around, when those plants are reaching their full maturity, it can be ideal because you're not going to have the high temperatures that cause those plants to bolt. Instead, you've got cool temperatures. And instead of having to act quickly to harvest before bolting, you can just leave the plants out and harvest until you get the hard freeze that ends up killing the plants. And if the hard freeze is forecast and you can cover your plants with plastic to protect them overnight, you might still get another couple weeks. And so the question of when is the best time to harvest is different from spring to fall with the same plants because the weather conditions can be completely different. Make note in your garden journal about those type of things, and that can really make a big difference when you decide what you're going to grow into your fall garden. Red is asking, does anyone have shallot growing experience? My red shallots did great. With the gray shallots, I got one decent sized bulb and dozens of tiny ones smaller than my pinky finger at each planting site. So if anyone's, I haven't grown gray shallots. Shallots can be difficult for a lot of us. That for many, the best way to grow shallots is to actually start them in fall and let them grow, stay in the garden all the way into spring and summer, and then harvest them when they get to the right size. Because my winters are just so severe, I haven't been able to have much success with the shallots. So the time, shallots take a long time, could be a factor. The weather conditions could be a factor. There's a lot of things that can cause shallots to not do well. But if like Red, you've had problems with gray shallots, please enter it in the comments and we'll see what you have to say about it. So yeah, Red says, I planted them in the fall and the red ones did great. There you go. So it could just be the variety. Sometimes I was just talking about this. So this weekend, my garden club had their annual garden tour. And so about half a dozen of us allowed our members, there were about 30 of us, going garden to garden, seeing what gardens we had. My garden was on the tour this year. And I was talking to a couple of my gardener friends in my garden. And of course, I talked at length the whole time everybody was there, but specifically talking about strawberries. And I love TriStar strawberries. They're just doing great everywhere. My Quinault strawberries have been doing great for over 25 years. And last year, I tried a couple different varieties, and I talked about this in a video that I did last year. But some of those new varieties that I tried just haven't done well. The Ozark Beauty specifically, kind of like the gray shallots, just have not done well. This is the second year. So I put them in last year. In the first year, I got a bunch of strawberries from my TriStar strawberries. In the second year, those TriStar strawberries have just been filled throughout the season. Last year, I didn't get a single Ozark Beauty strawberry. And this year, I've got 2 beds, and I might have gotten 3 or 4 individual strawberries. So there's something about the Ozark Beauty in my garden that just doesn't do well. And I know it does well for a number of gardeners. Some of you probably are growing Ozark Beauty strawberries and love them. They just don't do well in my garden. So sometimes the answer is really hard to nail down. You've got red shallots that do great, and you got gray shallots that don't. And all the factors are the same, except they're different varieties. And that could be the answer right there, is it's maybe something to change out. Next year, grow more red shallots and then try a different shallot and see how well it does. If the new one does well, then you can probably narrow it down to this specific variety this year that wasn't working for you. So yeah, Big Wheel Dog says, my Ozark Beauties are sitting with fruits all over them. There you go. And that's one reason why I grew the Ozark Beauties because they're supposed to be filled with fruit, and it just doesn't work in my garden. So I'm planning. I've already got a number of my TriStar strawberries, the runners in little pots, and at least one. I'm going to give one of those Ozark Beauty beds another chance, but I'm not going to go into next year with 2 full beds that don't perform. So I'm going to pull out some of the strawberries and all of the Ozark Beauty strawberries in one of those beds, and I'm going to replant with the new TriStar that I've potted up because I know they do well. And I'm willing to gamble. I'm willing to give plants a chance, but I can't devote that much space to something that appears to not be happy in my garden. So I'm okay with that. Shandy's Garden says, I'm thinking about a harvest potluck with gardening friends and possibly another meetup for a seed swap in the fall. I love those get-togethers. Cool. Good for you. Yeah, the get-togethers, especially when you can be getting together in a garden, is just a fantastic way. I love talking gardening. I had lunch with a gardener friend of mine yesterday, and we spent an hour and a half doing nothing but talking gardening. So I can do that all day long. I love doing that with my gardener friends. And when you can stand in a garden and walk around and you share your stories, it just makes everything good. So yes, I strongly encourage get-togethers for your gardener friends. And either do it in their garden or do it in your own garden so that you can get the feel. Gardeners in a garden, there's just something about that energy that I absolutely love. So when we talk about the garden and walking through the garden, and I saw some of this weekend with some of the plants, I saw a melon that I didn't even know was there. My melon bed is doing great this year. I've already got 2 pretty big size melons. They're small melons. They haven't reached that point that they're supposed to be fully mature, but they look very, very close. So I'm making note. They're doing much better than any melon I've ever grown before. So they're looking really good, but we'll see how they taste and how everything else comes along. But the point here is check your garden every single day. If you're growing crops for harvest, there's a lot that can change from one day to the next. The key example, and you all know this, is zucchini. That zucchini that's 6 inches long, and you think, oh, tomorrow I'm going to come back and it's going to be the perfect size to throw on the grill. And then you come back the next day and suddenly it grew a foot overnight. How does that happen? You just think you're going to pick the perfect time, and the zucchini has different ideas. They become monstrous in no time at all. You have to check every single day. If you skip a day, your plants are just going to become overrun by the zucchini monsters. Holds true with a lot of the other things we're growing. Cucumbers is a great example too. In my video about the cucumbers, a couple of videos about cucumbers, I talk about the harvesting. And you've got to harvest cucumbers. You've got to harvest all the cucumbers when they are ready to harvest. If you let a single cucumber remain hidden, that can destroy the rest of your season with those cucumbers. When you think about how plants work, the whole reason they're growing their flowers and setting their fruit is so they can propagate. So a cucumber, a tomato, a pepper, all those fruits, they're growing seeds inside. And all the plant wants to do is mature that fruit so that those seeds can be released and more baby plants are going to grow. Once a plant has achieved that, its life is done. It says, I was successful. I have propagated and my seeds are spreading. And I've seen that most obviously with cucumbers. If you leave one cucumber, and it's usually one of the very first ones, it's hidden by a bunch of leaves, and you discover it weeks later, and it has become big and yellow, and that's usually why you see it, is because it has become so big and yellow, and now it's peeking out from underneath the leaves that were covering it. Well, it's too late. You told the plant that its job was done. It was able to grow a cucumber to full maturity, not the maturity that we think of when we eat the fruit, but the maturity that the plant is thinking about as far as the seeds have ripened. The seeds are fully mature in that big, monstrous yellow cucumber. And so the plant has no need anymore to send out new growth, new flowers, new fruit. And that's a good indicator. If you're harvesting your cucumbers and suddenly the cucumbers just aren't producing anymore, look closely. You'll probably find one of those hidden monsters that has caused the plant to shut down. So you got to get out every day during harvest season to try to figure out if the plant is ready, if it's giving you what it is that you want. And particularly the fruits, the more often you harvest, the more likely it's going to set new flowers and new fruit, because it wants to propagate. It's going to keep giving you fruit until it reaches that point that it has the seeds that are going to spread. If you harvest the fruit before they reach that point, the plant's going to keep growing and the plant's going to keep producing. So keep that in mind. When we talk the individual plants, the root crops, like a carrot, well, you're harvesting the whole plant. So the carrot's just going to keep growing until it reaches that point of setting the seed. Many of the root crops we're growing, the carrots, the beets, they're biennials. So it's a 2-season process. They're going to grow to full size in the first season, and then they'll overwinter. And in the next season, they'll set the flowers and set the seeds, and then the plant dies. So most of the annuals that we think of in our garden, those kind of plants, some of them are biennial, some of them are perennials. Tomatoes and peppers are perennials. They'll keep growing for years until something kills them. We treat most of our plants as an annual, so we're harvesting them before they get to that propagation point. And understanding that can make a difference as to deciding when you want to harvest or how long you want the fruit to stay on the plant. Texas Organic TV, hello to you. Thank you so much for that contribution. Thanks for all your wisdom and support. Always appreciated. Oh, you are so very welcome. As I've said many, many times, I just love getting together on Wednesdays and love you being here. And thank you for the support for that. It's so much fun. Like I was saying with my gardener friends, I can talk for an hour and a half with no problem with different gardening subjects. And I'm so glad to be able to share the wisdom and support. And I'm glad you said that, because the support really is a big reason why I do this. It's trying to provide some of that information, some of that help, answering the questions so that you realize you can do this. I've made so many mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes I make when I'm getting into my harvest season is that I wait too long. I've already talked about the cucumbers in particular, but the tomatoes, particularly if it's a new variety, and I'm not exactly sure of the color. And so I'm waiting for it to turn red, and then I'm waiting for it to turn purple. Like Cherokee purple, for instance, is a good example. Cherokee purple does not turn purple all over. In fact, the purple is kind of questionable as to whether it's even purple or not. And there's still a lot of green at the top of a Cherokee purple after it started changing and turned purple. And so if you've never grown Cherokee purple tomatoes before and you're waiting for that dramatic color change, it's not going to happen. And so you're waiting and you're waiting, and before you know it, the fruit is splitting, it's dropping off the plant, you harvest it and it's all mushy because it's overripe. Those are mistakes that all of us make at one point or another with a lot of the plants that we're growing, and they're great lessons. All of those things that go wrong are great lessons to learn moving forward. When we go to harvest, particularly with some of those newer varieties that we're not familiar with, touch now becomes an important factor. And so touch can really work with a lot of the plants. For instance, the tomatoes, when you squeeze an unripe green tomato, it's hard. I mean, it's rock hard. There's no give. As the tomato begins to ripen, it begins to soften. And so learning that feel, if you're growing a tomato and you think, well, it kind of looks like it's ripe, but I'm not sure, squeeze it And I'm not talking a big squeeze, just kind of just bring your fingertips around the tomato and just press lightly. And if you start to feel that it gives a little bit, pull it, cut it open, eat it, see what you think. And chances are it's probably pretty close to that perfect ripeness. Eggplants are very similar. Eggplants are very firm. And then suddenly one day you go out and you kind of just do that squeeze test very lightly on an eggplant. If you squeeze and the skin pops back, it's not ripe yet. But if you squeeze and there's a little indentation where your fingertip squeezed, you've reached the point that it's time to harvest the eggplant. And so learning those kind of feels, fruit is similar. So peaches, that's one way that I tell that my peaches are ready. The color looks good. I want to harvest my peaches at a point before the birds get to them. When I do the squeeze test on fruits like that, and there's just a little bit of give, then I pull a fruit off and I taste it. And it's like, oh, yep, delicious. They're all ready to harvest. So all of our senses, I already talked about the visual component, but the feel, put those two together. Use your sight and use your feel, and you might be able to really refine the harvest point to get to the perfect point for you with those things that you're trying to grow. And it's still a learning process. I'm still learning a lot of those things as to if it's too firm, if it's not firm enough. And most of the time you really can't tell a big difference, but there are some that you just get that feel, literally feel, and it's like, yep, it's time. Shandy's garden is saying I had to pull my Walla Walla onions because they all bent over, even after cutting the leaves a little shorter. I don't know how to get onions to seed, I guessed, and that was the first successful onion. So just keep trying. I've actually got 2 onions growing right now that are seeding, and I've done nothing to those tomatoes, or not tomatoes, onions. I've done nothing to those onions. The key being that it's going to be the second year. So in the first year, your onions are growing, and like you saw, the leaves bend over. If you want seeds, leave them in the ground for a whole nother season, and then they'll send up that flower stalk and those flowers. So I've got a video on harvesting onion seeds, and I talk more about that, where you wait, and that's the key. Many of those plants, like I was talking about, the root crops, are biennials, and they're not going to get the flowers and the seeds until the following year. So if you were trying to get seed in the first year, that's probably the reason why everything bent over. And that's an indicator of onions being ready. Like garlic, when those leaves start browning and start falling over, it's time to harvest. If you're going to eat the onion, or if you're going to eat the garlic. If you want the onion seeds, you're going to have to leave those in the ground and wait for the flower stalk to develop, and then you can get the seeds at that point. So yeah, I'm sure Jay is probably right on top of it. I'll scroll back down. I'm sure she's already posted the link, or close to posting the link, about the onion video I have with collecting the onion seeds. But and the chives are a little bit different. So in that video where I talk about how to collect onion seeds and chives seeds, chives will send up flowers and they will seed in the first year. And actually, because they're a perennial, they'll keep coming back and they'll keep sending flower stalks up every year. Not a 1 year, 2 year kind of a thing, but the onions are different. And so that's why you just kind of have to leave them in the ground. The Wickershire Project is saying, fall soil test for soil. What seed would you plant in a 16-ounce cup? Roots to death. We have peat moss, forest soil, leaf mulch, sand, clay, loam, and pure clay. Pick a test seed. It depends on what you're trying to test. And so lettuce is generally a plant that I recommend for testing your soil, because lettuce grows so quickly that you can see a lot of things. So if you suspect your soil is contaminated, try to grow lettuce And if the lettuce doesn't grow or has mutations, then you've got some type of contamination. If you're worried about the nutrient levels in your soil, then plant lettuce. If it grows quickly and gives you nice bright green leaves, or whatever the color of the leaves are that you're expecting, and a nice firm plant, then your nitrogen levels are pretty good, and also most of the other macronutrients that you can expect. You can see it happening in a lettuce. If the plant doesn't do well and it stays kind of yellow and withered, that tells you your nutrient levels aren't good at all. If you want to check the organic matter in your soil and how well your soil is holding moisture, lettuce is another good one, because if it dries out, it's going to wilt. And so you can see the leaves wilting pretty quickly on a lot of the lettuce. So lettuce is a good test crop for a lot of the things that you might be growing. And so if you're concerned about the soil, that's one way I would grow, is something like that, fast growing and a really good indicator. The particular, with the mulches as well. That if you have a concern about using straw as a mulch because you think the straw might be contaminated with herbicides, lettuce is another great choice as well, because the herbicides are all, for the most part, broadleaf herbicides. Lettuce is a broadleaf plant, and you're going to see any indication in a lettuce before other plants. So that's what I usually use as a test seed if I've got concerns, all kinds of different concerns. Now, if there's another specific concern, I'll see if I see another question from you later on. But yeah, try a couple different kinds of lettuces, and that's usually a quick way to try to see if it's going to give you the answers that you're looking for. Robin Gardens says, only had 5 Walla Walla germinate this winter. I still have 2 in the ground, getting very large, and stems still very firm. All other varieties have been harvested for weeks. Crazy. Yeah, and onions are, so I'm guessing for you, Robin, yeah, you should have great success with Walla Walla. The thing about the onions for a lot of gardeners is not understanding the long day varieties versus the short day varieties versus the intermediate day varieties, because different onions require different amounts of light to actually start bulbing. For the northern United States, Walla Walla from Walla Walla, Washington, is a great variety, and most of the time does pretty well. I've tried growing Walla Walla here in the middle of the country in Colorado, and it just doesn't work for me. So there could be a lot of other issues. Again, light is often a consideration, but the temperature, the moisture levels, there are good years and bad years. So just keep trying, Robin, and maybe next year it'll be a little bit different, because it is crazy. We had in our discussions this weekend with our tours and yesterday at lunch, the topic was squash. Almost everybody in my area is having a terrible year with squash and zucchini in particular. They're just not performing like they normally do. And nobody knows the answer. I don't know the answer. There are just some years where things are off and the plants just don't do well. And Robin's right, it's crazy. I wish there was an easy answer that it's like, why are my squash not growing this year? You ask the AI and the answer pops out. I get asked that question a lot. Someone will comment on a video and the question will be, why aren't my tomatoes doing well this year? I have absolutely no idea, because there's a lot of years that I don't know the answer in my garden, let alone what your garden happens to be. And so that's why I say, try again next year and see if maybe they do better, because sometimes we just don't know. You have 5 onions that germinate, and then the next year you've got 50 that germinate. The best success I've had with onions has been when I don't do anything. It was at the school garden, and I've mentioned this before, where we let the onions go to seed, and we were going to harvest all the seed, but a lot of that seed fell on the ground. That next year, I had the best onions I'd ever had before, because they were essentially sown in fall, and they were in the ground and they sprouted in spring at the perfect time for them. I had nothing to do with it. They were already in the ground. They sprouted, they grew, and it was ideal. So who knows what the conditions are from one season to the next as far as the plant is looking at it. We can look at it from our perspective, but we don't always know exactly what that most important factor is for the plant and for the seed to germinate to become the plant. And that's what makes gardening so fun and exciting, right? Is because we don't know the answers. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Teresa's asking, when do you harvest cantaloupe? So cantaloupe, and you've probably seen some of this because there's a lot of pictures online and you can look at it. Depending on the type of muskmelon or cantaloupe that you're growing, look at the webbing. So look at the webbing on the outside of the cantaloupe, and you're looking for pretty symmetrical webbing. You're looking for the whole cantaloupe to be covered by that web. If you've got some smooth areas where the webbing hasn't fully developed yet, then it's not quite ready. You're also looking at the size. Depending on the size of the melon, you can kind of wait for it to get close to that size, depending on how many days to maturity that particular seed is. And so the size, the webbing around it, those are good indicators. One of the ones that I use most often for most of my melons is the stem. So remember, the whole point of the plant growing the fruit is to get that fruit ripe so that the seeds are going to be viable and can be planted. When that fruit has reached that ripe level, the plant's done. It doesn't need to send any more energy, any more nutrients, any more moisture into that fruit. And you can see that, especially with melons. When the stem begins to turn brown, when it begins to dry out a little bit, the plant has shut it down. And so when you see that, it's time to harvest. There's no more improvement coming to that melon. The cantaloupe is basically being released from its mother because it's grown up. So look for those few factors, and hopefully that'll give you an indication. So I mentioned that I've got my melons, they're little mini watermelons. That's what I'm looking for because the size looks really good. The color looks really good. And now I'm looking at the stem, waiting for the stem to start to turn brown. And that's when I'm going to harvest. So the visual piece is great. You can also do, it doesn't work as well with cantaloupe, but you can still do the cantaloupe. It works better with other melons. But you can do the thumbnail test. And the idea being that kind of like the eggplant where I was talking about, you push your fingertips in. You can do the same thing with your fingernail. And it takes experience, and you're looking for a couple different things, but you're basically pressing your thumb into the skin to see how firm it is. And that's an indicator of when the melon is ready. Cantaloupes should actually give a little bit. They're closer to the eggplant where they will begin to soften as they reach that full ripeness point. One of the things I use around here, like when I go to the store, we have Rocky Ford cantaloupes here in Colorado that are just incredible. And I got one last week, and you can smell it. So smell the flower end, not the stem end. And when they're fully ripe, you can actually smell the ripe fruit that's inside. When it reaches that point, it definitely needs to be harvested because often it can go a little overripe, and that's when you start smelling it. So put all your senses together, and hopefully that'll give you an indication of the best time. And then you just take note. You harvest, you eat, and you say, yeah, this was right, or nope, it needs to stay on. I'd recommend, and I like to just harvest one of whatever it is I've got a bunch of, and see and taste and feel. And if that one is right, then it's time to do the others. I've been gardening a long time. This is a mistake I've made before as well, where it's like, oh, I'm going to harvest the whole crop. And you harvest the whole crop and half of it isn't ripe yet. it's okay to harvest a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow and a little bit the next day. And that can be a good way to get a lot of your fruit and get it at exactly the right time so that you don't lose out on stuff. Yeah, Rick says the tendril and the yellow belly for watermelons. And so you've probably heard this about the yellow belly. The idea being particularly the big melons, the big watermelons, they're resting on the ground, and the side that is shaded from the sun, the side that is resting on the ground, will turn yellow because initially it's white and it will gradually turn yellow. And that's an indication of when the watermelons are reaching that full ripeness level. So you're exactly right. Thank you for that, Rick. And the melons that I'm growing, because they're the smaller melons, that doesn't work as well because there's just a very small spot that would turn yellow, but the fruit isn't big enough to really have much of an indication. But I look for it most of the time because it's so little contact with the ground, because it's like a ball, that I just look for even dark coloring all the way around, and that actually works pretty well. Red's asking, does anyone have good tips for saving seed of summer and winter squash? Oh yeah, absolutely. I got a bunch of videos on that, and I'm sure that link will probably pop up here soon. But the idea is that you just take your seed, and this holds true with any seed you're going to save, and put it into a cool, dark, dry location, and it'll last through the winter, and you'll be able to plant it next year. The key is cool, dark, and dry, and that way that it'll last the longer. You could use glass jars, you can use plastic, you can use cardboard boxes, you could use paper envelopes. I haven't noticed much difference in the container because my seed is dry going into the container. I've heard people say, oh, don't save your seeds in plastic because it leads to mold. Well, no, it's not the plastic that leads to mold. It's the fact that you put wet seeds into a plastic container that led to the mold. Make sure that your seeds are completely dry before you start saving them, and you won't have mold issues at all. So the tips, and I've got videos on a bunch of this, Red, so you can see specifically how I do it. But you collect the seeds, wash them off, dry them for weeks, then put them into storage, and then you'll be able to grow them next year with very little problems. And it works for me, and it's worked for a whole bunch of other gardeners. It's actually very easy. You just got to make sure you take those steps to take dry seeds and put them into a dry location, and then enjoy it in the following year. That's the biggest part about growing seeds that I like, is that you save them and keep doing it over and over again. Concrete Jungle is saying, I've been practicing accidental harvesting recently. I keep snapping tomato stalks when tidying up with too much vigor. Thankfully, still managed to get most of the green fruit ripened indoors. Good for you. Yeah, I've been experimenting a little bit along these lines, and it's actually been a very successful experiment. I was pruning off the lower branches of my tomatoes, and in some areas, I took the two plants that were growing in a pot, and I planted the pot and allowed the two to grow, with the idea being kind of like thinning out most of the rest of my garden, is I would remove one of those plants and leave the strongest one in that spot. It just was easier than separating the plants in the beginning, and I ended up with too many tomato plants. So I knew I was going to be getting rid of some of the plants. So a few weeks ago, I had that with two of the plants growing from just a few inches apart in the ground where I planted them. And I thought, okay, I'll pull this one. And so I should have cut. I pulled the plant out. And of course, in hindsight, I knew better. The roots had intertwined. They had grown together. So when I pulled the one tomato plant, both tomato plants pulled out of the ground. Well, what do you do at that point? Do you say, oh, I screwed up, now I've lost my tomato plants? No, you pull off the one that you were getting rid of anyway, and you put the other one back in the ground. So a full size, it was probably 3 feet tall, maybe close to 4 feet tall, had been pulled out of the ground, and I put it back in the ground, covered up, watered immediately, made sure that it's had water every single day and not dried out. The leaves all wilted, they all turned yellow, they started turning brown, but I still watered, still tended to that plant. And now new growth has emerged and new leaves are developing and new suckers are popping from the stem. So you can really abuse tomatoes quite a bit. So even those branches that break off, you can put those in the ground and you can expect that they will root and give you a new plant. I mentioned that in one of my videos about cloning tomatoes, I think a few years ago. And that's how you clone tomatoes, is you take cuttings and you root them and you grow a whole new plant. So yes, by all means, harvest the fruit off of those branches that get broken off. But if your season is long enough, you might be able to just go ahead and put those branches back in the ground and continue to grow that as a new tomato plant and continue to harvest with that new growth. It's going to take weeks before you get to that point. And for some of us, our seasons aren't long enough, but you can give it a try. That's a lot of fun. Like I'm actually enjoying seeing this tomato plant come to life again. And I'll see if I get any fruit off of it, because I basically lost 3 weeks of growth while this whole process has been playing out. But if I can get some fruit off of it, I'm going to be very happy. And it's a cherry tomato. It's a berries crazy yellow, so it should fruit pretty quickly. And that I'm going to chalk that up as a great lesson learned and a great example of how resilient the tomatoes are. And yeah, Rick is right. Use the suckers to get new tomato plants, and you'll get a clone of the plant that you pulled the suckers off of. So the suckers are really easy because the suckers have a growing point, a growing tip, and they want to keep growing. So that's an easy way to get a new plant. Leanne says, I'm growing Georgia candy roaster squash. They're huge. Just trying to figure out when to cut them down to roast. So experiment, try it. You know, like I was saying, get one today, get one tomorrow, get one the day after, and try to find out just exactly the right point that you want to harvest. Last year, I grew the Tahitian melon squash, and it's like a butternut squash. And I had the same issue. They would keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger when left on the vine. They changed color. It's a brown squash. So it changed color, kind of like a butternut squash, from a light brown to a dark brown when they started getting bigger. And there was a medium point. The big ones were a little dense and not quite as sweet. The young ones tasted pretty good, but there wasn't a lot of flesh. So finding that middle point was all experimentation, with leaving some on the plant and taking some off the plant. And that's often the best way, especially if you're growing a new variety that you're not familiar with, is just, if you've got a bunch of them, keep harvesting at different points until you find that happy spot, the one that really gives you what you're looking for. Mobius says, eggplant. I make a garden ratatouille and can it, pressure can, even with the tomatoes. Awesome. Yeah, I actually talked a lot about pressure canning with my gardening friends this weekend. So pressure canning those low acid plants like eggplant, good for you. I like that idea of preserving. We talked about preserving recently on the show. And so using a pressure canner and making something like ratatouille, that's the way to do it. Then you just open up, eat it, and you got that wonderful garden flavor. So very nice. Sam is saying, next year I'll successfully grow eggplant. Good for you. Yeah, try the things that are a challenge. You know, when I'm asked, and I've been asked a lot in recent months about the plant that's hardest for me to grow, and I always talk about okra. Okra is just such a challenge for me. This year, I'm growing okra again. because my granddaughters like pickled okra, so it was their decision to try okra again. It's actually doing pretty well. The plants are still small, but I've got okra. I've got more okra pods on my plants now than I've ever had before. And the plants are still actively growing, and I expect more. So I've said in the past that I wasn't planning on growing okra again because I've just not had good success with it. And then suddenly this year I'm growing it and having great success. So yeah, pick that plant, eggplant, okra, whatever your nemesis is or something you have difficulty with, keep doing it and plan today to grow it next year. Start doing some research to find which varieties might be best in your garden, find out about the nutrient needs, the water needs, the sun needs. But I love the middle of summer as a planning point for next year's garden because of the things that end up surprising me, and they are doing better than I expected or doing worse than I expected. So have fun with that, definitely. Yeah, Owen says, so weird because I can't stop my okra invasion, but can't grow anything better than Scott. That's good. Yeah, Colorado is not known for its fields of okra, and that's the big issue. Is we get sun, we get heat, but usually not for the length of time that okra needs. And I've had a lot of people tell me that, yeah, in their garden okra grows like weeds. and like Owen says, an okra invasion. So that's why we all look at our individual gardens and figure out what we need to do. And this year I put it in my sunniest bed, and it's doing better than it's ever done before. So finding out those little things that can make a difference are often big things that make a difference. Alora says, Gardner Scott, I'm a little jealous because okra's never done well for me, and it's one of my favorite things to eat. There you go. Yeah, that's the way it's been for me. I love making gumbo, and only once have I ever been able to make gumbo with my own okra, and that was just because it was one of those terrible years, and there wasn't enough okra to pickle, but there was enough okra, just a couple pods to make the gumbo. But take it from me, give it another try, and then take a couple years off if it doesn't work, and then give it another try, and then a couple years off, then give it another try, and eventually it could be one of those good years where everything just seems to be exactly what you're looking for. And for me with the okra, I guess this is the year. One of the gardens that I toured this weekend, their okra is probably about twice as high as mine, but they don't have as many pods. So I'm fine that my plants aren't as big as maybe they should be. I did get a late start with them, but the fruit development on them is just fantastic. Wickisher Project is saying, can you remind everyone about determinant versus indeterminate, canning versus slow harvesting? So thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely do that. So when we talk about, and this holds true actually with potatoes too, but primarily we're talking about tomatoes. There are essentially two different types of tomatoes. You've got determinate tomatoes, which have a predetermined point where the fruit is going to set and ripen, and the plant is essentially done. So generally, it's a bush type plant. All of the flowers pop on within a couple week period. All of those flowers become fruit at about the same time. And so they're ready to harvest the whole plant at pretty much the same time. Within a few days, within a few weeks, the plant is producing a bunch, literally a bushel of tomatoes in many cases. And they're ideal for canning because if you want to can tomatoes, if you want to make tomato sauce, if you want to make tomato paste, you usually are going to do that because you've got a whole bunch of tomatoes. If you want to do it, then you need to have a whole bunch of tomatoes to do it. That's where the indeterminate tomatoes come in. So many of the paste tomatoes, the tomatoes that we are making into sauce and tomato paste, many of those plants are determinate tomatoes because you get one big crop and you harvest everything and then you process them and you preserve them. and or a determinate plant will still stay alive. It will still grow, but it's not going to set flowers and set a whole nother load of fruit. If you live in a warm area that doesn't kill the tomatoes, then yeah, the next year the plant will continue to grow. But it's kind of a one and done type of plant for most of us in our gardens. Determinate tomatoes for canning. Now, if like me, you like tomatoes every day of the tomato season, and you want to go out and you harvest some of your basil and some of your cucumbers and some of your tomatoes, and every night you have a fresh salad from your garden, now you want to think about the indeterminate tomato. So an indeterminate tomato grows more like a vine, and it will just keep growing and growing and growing. And so it grows from the center stem, the main stem, and then it will send out little suckers at the junctions of the leaf and the stem. And those suckers will turn into new stems. And all of those stems, all of those suckers, all of this, the growth of the plant just keeps producing flowers. And all those flowers turn into fruit. Because of the way it grows, you'll have the main stem, it'll grow. And at one of those junctions of the stem and the leaves and the suckers, you'll just above that or just below that, depending on how big the plant is, you'll get a cluster of flowers. And those flowers will begin to fruit. The plant continues to grow. And then a little higher up on the plant, you get another cluster of flowers. And those flowers will begin to turn to fruit. And then a little bit higher on the plant, it happens again. So that's why you get a full season of tomatoes from a tomato plant, is because as it grows, it keeps setting a new bunch of flowers and a new bunch of tomatoes. And if you allow some of those suckers to develop, the same thing happens on those suckers, where you get cluster followed by another cluster, followed by another cluster. And that keeps happening until something kills the plant. And you could have a tomato, if your season is long enough and if the plant is healthy enough, you can easily have a tomato plant 20, 25 feet long. When I was growing tomatoes in the greenhouse at the Galileo School, my tomato plants were between 12 and 15 feet long, because it was a dome greenhouse, had a lot of space. I had wires and cables, and I pruned and I trellised and I directed the tomatoes where I wanted them to be, and they grew very, very long. Indeterminate tomatoes with clusters all along the stem. So thank you for bringing that up. And those are the basic differences in what you're looking for as far as tomatoes. And so if you didn't know that, or if you were a little surprised because your plants weren't producing the way you expected this year, next year, that's what you look for. When you get your seeds or when you buy your plants, check to see if it's a determinate tomato versus an indeterminate tomato. And like I mentioned, with potatoes have a similar characteristic because they're related to tomatoes. So there are potatoes that will set all of the tubers at the same time. And when it's time to harvest, you just dig up the whole plant and all of the tubers. And then there are other potatoes, indeterminate potatoes, that will continue to set new tubers as the plant grows. And the way that the potatoes grow underground, it's basically just an underground stem, and it can set potatoes at different points along that stem. So if you're growing potatoes and you come to harvest time and you dig it all up and you've got some really big potatoes and you've got some really small potatoes farther down, it could be because you're growing an indeterminate variety. If you harvest everything and they're all pretty much the same size, then you're probably growing a determinate variety. The thing about the potatoes is they're much harder to determine. When you get your seeds for tomatoes, or you get your plants, almost always it'll tell you that it's a bush tomato or a determinate tomato, or it's a vining tomato or an indeterminate tomato. You really don't get that as much with the potatoes. And so check out Tony O'Neill, Simplified Gardening Channel. He's got a great potato guide, and he's got hundreds and hundreds of potato varieties. And that's one of the things that he tracks, is whether they're determinate or indeterminate potato types. So yeah, check out Simplified Gardening, and check in his description of the videos, and you should see a link to the potato guide. I used to have it written here. I don't see it right now. But yeah, check out Squoosh is the app that I've got listed as Tony's app, and it's all about potatoes. So one of those things you probably didn't know: determinate versus indeterminate potatoes, just like tomatoes. And it really can make a difference in how your plants grow and how your harvest actually goes, because of what you may have been expecting or not. Dusty Flat says, if I'm canning whole tomatoes, I'll remove skin. Some say there's a bacteria on skin, and some say they give a bitter taste. So yeah, there's definitely bacteria on the skin. But when you can tomatoes, depending on which type of acid you're adding as part of the canning process, and then your water bath canning with the heat, the whole point of that is to kill the bacteria and to keep the bacteria from harming the tomato. So I wouldn't worry too much about the bacteria on the skin because of the processing method. And so if you're using water bath canning, and especially if you decide to use pressure canning with your tomatoes, like in a ratatouille, it's going to kill the bacteria. As long as you've got that low acid environment, it's going to take, or high acid environment, low pH environment. That's what you're looking for with the tomatoes. So when you look at the recipes for canning tomatoes, you'll see that it often asks you to add lemon juice or ascorbic acid. Not so much vinegar, but occasionally vinegar. But the whole point of that, even though tomatoes are acidic, you want to add extra acid to take care of this concern about bacteria during the canning process. But it does affect the flavor. You are right. The skin of a tomato does have a different taste. Bitter is personal, and so you might be able to detect that bitterness. Absolutely. So nothing wrong with taking the skin off of your tomatoes when you can. And most of the time, when I was teaching canning for extension, that's what we would do. We would do the little X. So do a little X cut in the flower end of the tomato, and then you dunk them in hot water, simmering water, and then take them out and put them in a hot or in an ice bath, and the skin is going to start peeling at that cut. That's an easy way to peel your tomatoes, is to do a little X cut and do a quick blanching to get that peel started, and then you just peel off the skin of your tomatoes pretty easily, and then you can them. So absolutely, whole tomatoes, that's what we would do, is we would take the skin off. For sliced tomatoes, we would often leave the skin on, because often we were trying to pack as many tomatoes into a jar to make into sauce later on. So it didn't really matter that the skins were there. So personal preference, but a lot of people do remove the skins, more so, I think, because of the taste than because of the bacteria. So time is just flying by. What else was I going to talk to? I'm looking at my tips to make sure I covered everything. When you go out to harvest, and this is one of the things that I make mistakes of all the time, is, oh, I'm just going to go out and check on my garden, and then you say, oh, this zucchini is ready, and you twist off the zucchini, and then you go, oh, these tomatoes are ready, and before you know it, you've got a handful or an armful, and you're not even close to harvesting. So you can take this approach a couple different ways. Go ahead and harvest as an event. Go ahead and take your basket out to harvest. Otherwise, if you just think, oh, I'm going to do these 1 or 2 or 3 things, you're going to end up too much. So during harvest season, even if I'm not planning on harvesting, I usually take my basket or my bucket and put it out in the garden so that if I change my mind, I'm already there and I can fill the basket and take it into the kitchen. So it's kind of a time saving thing and a little bit of efficiency. I mean, I don't mind walking back and forth 2 or 3 times extra, but that can save you a little bit of time if you just have everything pre-positioned or planned that you're going to be doing the harvesting rather than just make it happen. There are times, particularly with like my raspberries or the strawberries, where I go out planning to do a harvest, or let me rephrase that. I'm planning to do a harvest of a lot of the strawberries, but when I actually get out there, I'm weeding, I'm working in other areas. Oh, there's a fresh strawberry. I'll eat that one. Then I do other work. Oh, there's another fresh strawberry. I'll eat that. And so I have to be careful with some of my crops that I'm planning to harvest because I end up eating all the strawberries before I actually get to that point of harvesting a whole bunch of strawberries. And so I mean, I don't mind it. I love fresh strawberries, but when I want to harvest a bunch of strawberries to make like strawberry jam or a strawberry dessert, whatever it happens to be, and there aren't enough strawberries to do that because I've been eating them every day for days, just be aware that is a common tendency, and you may not be the only one doing that because I end up doing that a lot too much, especially with the raspberries. I just can't resist eating the fresh raspberries right out of the garden. That's just one of my favorite things to do. And when we do that, or when I do that, even though I kind of feel a little guilty because I was planning on harvesting a big crop, I still feel good because each of those raspberries just tastes so darn good. And if I can make myself happy 20 times in a day eating those raspberries, it's worth that moment of guilt because I didn't harvest all of them at the same time. Okay. That's me sharing a little bit of my guilt with you. Jay, thank you so much. Jay it's just so spectacular. I wish there was a way we could give a thumbs up. I know you can give a thumbs up to this chat. You can give a thumbs up to my videos, but there's no way to give a thumbs up to Jay for her extra efforts and everything she does. So maybe if she sees a quick boost in the thumbs up to this video, she knows that those of you who haven't given a thumbs up are giving the thumbs up to her and not necessarily to me. So big thumbs up to Jay Dixon for just doing such a fantastic job. Reminding everybody about my book, of course. Did a podcast this last week, actually did 2, a radio show and a podcast. And so I'll post when that comes up. It's supposed to be out in September, and still plugging the book, still doing podcasts, still talking about different things as far as the book is concerned. So it's still out there. Wherever you get your books, you can get Gardener Scott's Guide to Raised Bed Gardening. And I plan on talking about it in a few months, but I think it's going to be a great holiday gift if you're trying to get ideas for yourself or for other gardeners you might know. Gardener Scott's Guide to Raised Bed Gardening could be the one. Shandy's Garden says, I'm so proud of myself this year because I took different measures besides memory for each of my different lilies to mark the different colors because I want to move them around. Great idea. This is another one of those things that so many of us just haven't figured out how to figure out what we're growing. I'm terrible at this, where I don't know what I'm doing. And I planted, and so I like your suggestion. I have started taking more photos, but I put a whole bunch of lilies in the ground this year just because I had lilies to put in the ground. I made a video about planting the lilies, but I didn't mark which varieties were which lilies. And now next year I have to go back and I have to figure out a way like that too, so that I remind myself of which is which. What I've started doing more so with my trees and my fruit bushes, but I got some nice metals like stainless steel plant stakes. And I'm starting to do that throughout my garden. If there's a plant that's just doing great and I love it and I can't remember what it is, Then I go back into my records to figure out what it is, or I take a picture and I search on, through the app to find out what kind of plant it is. And then I write it down on this stake and put it next to the plant. So next time, if I want to propagate, if I want to move, if I want to just know what it is I'm growing, I've got the plants marked. And so definitely figure out a method. That's a good suggestion, so that when you want to move or when you want to propagate, you don't have to do the deep search to remind yourself of what it is you're growing. I'm growing so many different plants, so many different varieties, that I don't remember it all. And I need that reminder right there in the ground at my feet to tell me. And so if you think you need to do it, do it. It's a fun, easy way to make sure that you don't think you're losing your mind or losing your memory. I'm not worried about losing my memory. It's just I've got other things, and that was one of those little things I didn't devote to my memory. So plant marker helps. Pat, good to see you here. Thank you for that. Could you touch on spaghetti and acorn squash harvesting? Sure. And so, I already talked a little bit about the basics of melons, and much of that holds true for the squash. So when we talk about the spaghetti squash in particular, and the acorn squash, there's a noticeable color change. So like the acorn squash, depending on what kind of acorn squash you're growing, you'll start seeing a change from like light green to dark green. If it happens to be one of those varieties that's like a yellow or an orange, then you'll start seeing those changes. The spaghetti squash has that creamy whitish color to it. And it's the same kind of thing. You're noticing the color change to get to the point that you're beginning to think, okay, it's getting close. And so that's why at the beginning I was talking about knowing what it should look like when it reaches full maturity. And so if you've got a picture on the seed packet, or if you bought the plant and not sure what it should look like, do a search, but get an idea of what color it should be, and that's a good indicator. The acorn squash, the touch test doesn't work as well on the acorn squash. And when you talk about the winter squashes, like the spaghetti squashes, it also doesn't work as well. That summer squash, you can do the squeeze and it gives a little bit. You can kind of do that with the spaghetti squash. When it's still young, it'll give a little bit. But winter squashes develop a harder skin, and that hard skin is what carries it through the winter, the storage of it. So when you do the squeeze test or do the thumbnail test where you press into it and it's hard, then that's an indication as well that it's getting to the point of harvest. And you can look at the stem again. The stem leading to the squash will begin to change color when that squash is reaching the full maturity point. So a lot of visual when you talk squashes, a lot of visual. And then harvest one. If you've got a whole bunch like the spaghetti squash in particular, you can harvest most squashes at any point. The key is, do you want it to reach full maturity so that it reaches full size? You can still harvest a spaghetti squash when it's young and cut it open and, remove the seeds, take your fork and turn it into spaghetti on the inside of the flesh, and it will still work and it will still taste great. And younger tends to be a little bit sweeter sometimes than the fully ripe squashes. So, but look for the color first. I think that'll be the best indication. Like with the Tahitian melon squash I mentioned, once they reached their full size, they really didn't grow anymore. They just changed color. They darkened. And that's generally what I look for in the squashes, is that darkening of the color and no more change in the size. Go ahead and pick it and put it in storage or eat it, whatever it is you're planning to do with it. The thing about a lot of squashes is that I I harvest at different times as they get ready. And so if you were paying attention or noting the development of the fruit on the vine, the earlier fruit, the fruit that's closest to the main stem, is generally going to flower and fruit first. And the fruit farthest away from the main stem is going to be smaller because the vine is continuing to grow and it's putting new flowers, and those flowers are being pollinated and new fruit is setting. So that's another way to tell. If you're not sure, harvest the stuff that's closer to the main stem first, and it's most likely to be fully mature. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Pat, and gives you some ideas of what to look for. But it's hard to go wrong with most squashes. Even if they're not fully mature, you can still harvest and eat them when they're young, and it'll be just fine. The the biggest issue when we talk about those winter squashes, though, is if you're planning to store them, you really should try to let them ripen and reach full maturity on the vine. So, like I talked about in the beginning, how you're planning to use the fruit will influence when you plan to harvest it. If you're planning to just eat it right away, you can eat it when it's young. If you're planning to store it, then you should leave it on the plant and look for those color changes and look for the stem to start to darken, and the plant is telling you that it's mature and ready to be harvested. So boy, how the time flies. Steve says, thank you, everyone. Have a good week. See you around the interwebs. And Robin or Dina says, great live stream this week. Take care, everyone. Robin says, great live today. Thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed it. So, hey, I'll be back next week. We could do this all over again, still talking about our gardens that are growing. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for your support. Make sure you give Jay a thumbs up because she does such a great job. And just have a wonderful gardening week ahead. And of course, you know it, at every step, do everything you can to enjoy your gardening. I'll see you next Monday.